This is part one of our four-part series of Agent Provocateurs, Cointelpro, and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights Police Report investigation. According to The Intercept, at the height of 2014, the Black Lives Matter protest in Ferguson, Missouri, FBI agents tracked the movement of an activist flying in from New York and appeared to have surveyed the homes and cars of individuals somehow tied to the protest, according to recently released documents provided to The Intercept. The newly released documents suggest the FBI put resources towards running informants as well as physical surveillance of anti-racist activists.
Back in the 1950s and the 1960s and the 1970s, the United States government had programs, some involving simple surveillance, some involving ways of getting information, some involving plots, basically to frame people for crimes.
It was secret at the time because it was by and large illegal.
It was an actual war against the entire left movement.
To eliminate, intimidate, incarcerate, and terrorize a people.
Everybody's locked up. That you can jail revolutionaries, but you can't jail a revolution.
First, in racial disparities, in how MPD officers use force and conduct traffic stops against people of color, particularly Black community members, compared to white community members in similar circumstances. We found a pattern of race discrimination and race-based policing and how MPD officers use covert social media to surveil or falsely engage with Black leaders, Black organizations, and government officials unrelated to criminal activity. We also see MPD's officers' consistent use of racist, misogynistic, and otherwise disrespectful language. Let's start by digging into this first one, racial disparities in how MPD officers use force and conduct traffic stops against people of color, particularly Black community members. In the investigation, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights looks at when MPD officers use force. Now, every police department uses force, but officers should not use more severe force against Black people. In fact, it's discriminatory and unlawful to do so. And our findings show that in Minneapolis, MPD officers use more severe force against Black people than white people do in similar circumstances. And we specifically look at neck restraints and chemical irritants when we looked at use of force. And here we found MPD officers are more likely to use neck restraints against Black community members compared to white community members in similar circumstances. We also found that MPD officers are more likely to use chemical irritants against Black community members compared to white community members in similar circumstances. Next, we looked at traffic stops. When we analyzed traffic stops because they are one of the most common ways that MPD officers and community members interact. And if you were pulled over by an MPD officer from January of 2017 through 2020, then your stop is reflected in this data around traffic stops. Here we found that MPD officers are more likely to stop vehicles with people of color and indigenous individuals. And they treat Black and white individuals differently once they have pulled someone over. So let's start by looking at the decision to make the stop itself. MPD's data shows that MPD officers are more likely to stop a car with people of color and indigenous community members when their race is visible during daylight hours compared to when it is dark outside. Okay, so why is this important? Why does it matter that we look at daylight versus night? It matters because during daylight hours, it is more possible to see someone's race or ethnicity. So when an MPD officer has the potential to see the race of the people in the car because it's daylight, they are more likely to choose to stop a car that has a person of color or an indigenous community member in it compared to when it is dark outside and the race of the people in the vehicle is less visible. Now, importantly, this racial disparity in traffic stops exists across Minneapolis. It's not the result of traffic enforcement practices in a single precinct. So none of this can be explained or excused away by one precinct. Let's look next at what happens after an officer decides to stop a vehicle. Now, MPD's data shows that officers are more likely to stop Black community members for longer. They're more likely to search Black community members for their vehicles. They're more likely to cite Black community members, use force against Black community members, and arrest Black community members during a traffic stop. And this is when compared to white community members in similar circumstances. And that's important, that similar circumstances thing. And I'm going to go back to that here in a second. But let me just note real quick that MPD's data does not contain sufficient information for a similar analysis for Latino, Asian, Indigenous, or other racial groups for this specific type of analysis. However, MPD does have data to analyze looking at Black individuals, and here you see this pattern of race-based policing occurring across the board. Again, we found these patterns throughout the city, so none of this can be explained or excused away by one precinct. So I mentioned similar circumstances, and so I want to take a minute here to talk about the methodology behind this analysis because it's important. How did we determine that race is the likely reason for this difference? Since Black individuals comprise approximately 19% of the Minneapolis population, anything over 19% of all searches conducted by MPD officers of Black individuals would be disproportionate, a proportionality analysis. Here you see that analysis. From January 1, 2017 to May 24, 2020, MPD's data shows that 78% of all searches conducted by MPD officers were searches of Black individuals or their vehicles in MPD's 5 precincts.
The report doesn't indicate the economic impact these traffic stops and searches have on Black motorists. Impound fees, car toll, court dates and fees, missing work. Black motorists can experience being tased, beaten, unlawfully detained, choked, or shot to death. According to Demos, the racial wealth gap is substantial and is driven by public policy. Minnesota has the 3rd largest racial wealth gap in the United States. This report is one example how racist policing policies contribute to the racial wealth gap in Minnesota. Stay tuned for part 2 of Agent Provocateurs, Cointelpro, and the Minnesota Department of Human Rights Police investigation.